And joining us now from the nation's capital to talk about the events of 20 years ago today, there's Bob Rae, 21st Premier of the province of Ontario, now the Member of Parliament for Toronto Centre. How are you? Or should I start by saying happy anniversary, first of all?
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
How are you today, Mr. Rae?
Excellent, thank you.
Glad to hear it. Okay, I want to start with the events of today, 20 years ago. What's the most powerful memory you have of that day at Convocation Hall at U of T when you became the first ever NDP Premier in the history of Ontario?
Well, it was a very emotional day. First of all, we did the swearing in front of a lot of people because there are a lot of people who wanted to get in. Rather unusual to do it that way. My whole family was there. My mom and dad were there, so it was a very powerful experience. But I have to say that there was a sort of a sobering quality to the event. It was full of good cheer. That night we had a great celebration at the building itself, where literally thousands of people visited Queen's Park for the first time. That was quite wonderful. But of course, there was a terrific sort of overhang for me because I had been getting briefed all that month by Treasury officials and other people about the state of the provincial economy and some of the real challenges that were ahead. And so it was a day for me that was. We had to recognize there was going to be tough rowing ahead, and as it turned out, of course, there was. But even so, on that day, it was a great sense of celebration, a great sense of fun. I can remember a group of seniors singing "We Ain't Got a Barrel of Money," and
boy, was that ever true!
God knows that was true, and so it was. It was a very emotional day. It was
well. Let me take you back.
Wonderful.
I'll take you back 3 weeks earlier then, since I would like to know what sort of was going through your head on election night. The 6th of September, 1990. Did you know that night you were going to win?
I thought that night we were going to win the most seats. Our polling, which we'd stopped polling sort of the week before, showed us well ahead. But we didn't really know how that would figure in the seat count. And we also knew that over the weekend that, there's always a coming home factor to the other two parties. So we figured that it was going to, I thought there was going to be a minority government of some kind.
So maybe not yours, you mean?
Maybe not mine. It could have been that Mr. Peterson, Mr. Harris would have made some kind of arrangement. I don't know. I wasn't assuming that we were necessarily going to form the government, and I certainly wasn't assuming that we would win a majority. I think that was something that, even on the basis of the numbers, it's pretty hard to predict the majority on the basis of winning just over 37% of the vote. So that was just lucky in terms of how the seats broke in a number of different parts of the province where the NDP had never won seats before.
Okay, so you didn't know for sure you were going to win that night, and I remember hosting the CBC broadcast that night, and frankly, we were doing a lot of, running some pools that night, and I don't think too many people had the NDP winning that night, if my recollection is correct. But if you weren't sure you were going to win, once you saw the seats come in, once you knew you had a majority government, the next question then becomes, were you actually prepared for victory?
Oh, sure.
I mean, prepared to govern?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've always felt that that an NDP government in Ontario was a distinct possibility, indeed even a probability. I never bought into the theory that the NDP could never win government in Ontario. I always felt that given the way the seats can break and things can move around, that the possibility of a win was always there for us. I think that made me probably in a minority among a lot of New Democrats. I always used to joke that on election night there were a lot of New Democrats who demanded a recount because the joys of opposition seemed to a lot of people to be a whole lot more fun than some of the difficult responsibilities of governing.
Well, I'll tell you where I'm coming from on that, because if you're a Liberal and you win, you've got, not only previous Liberals, but you've got your federal cousins that you can go to for advice on how to form a government. Same with Conservatives. You had none of that. There was nobody else, provincially or federally, who was a New Democrat to go to.
No,
well, who?
Not true. Again, you've got a lot of people who've had experience in government. We had our provincial counterparts in a number of other parts of the country that that we certainly talked to. I talked to Premier Blakeney a great deal, to Mr. Romano and others about the experiences that they'd had and some of the realities of what was ahead. I think one of the great mythologies that's sort of been allowed to kind of perpetrate over many years is that that somehow the government was formed out of thin air, and that that we were not at all prepared and everybody was caught by total surprise. The fact of the matter is that as we went into the election, it was clear that things were, after the first week, things were going a lot better for us. That we had, in fact, I think a pretty clear sense that something very remarkable was taking place in the electorate, which it did. We gained about 20 points from the first night's polling to the last night's election, which is quite remarkable. It's not unprecedented, but it's quite remarkable. But the notion somehow that that everybody was caught completely unawares, and that the jokes about Bob Rae's cleaning ladies in the cabinet and all this kind of stuff. I mean, that was really the usual kind of right-wing propaganda that, frankly, we had to deal with for the entire time we were in government.
Okay, let me follow up on that, though.
That goes on.
That's an interesting point, because you went into that election with 19 seats. You came out of it with 74. Now, is it fair to assume that there were, I mean, I got to assume you had no kind of clue what kind of bench strength you had. You probably didn't know most of those folks, right?
Well, no, I knew them. Some of them I knew better than others. We had, we had some people who were very experienced, who'd been in the cabinet before, in the caucus before for a long time. We had people who'd been in municipal government, who'd had substantial experience. So yeah, but there were a lot of new members, a lot of rookie members who came in as the tide turned, and as the tide came in, of course they came in. Now, of course, everyone who wins an election says, well, I'm there because of me. That's inevitable. That's a sort of very human feeling for people to have. But the fact is there was a big tide that did bring in a lot of members who didn't have a lot of political experience. But that doesn't take away from the fact that at the core of the cabinet and at the core of the government there were and remain to be terrific ministers of great talent and great skill and great dedication who continue to play an important role in the life of the politics and the public service of the province.
Okay, let me follow up on that issue that you raised when we talked about the events of October 1st, 1990, which was, while it was a great day, you were getting briefings from finance ministry officials saying, guess what, we're about to go off a cliff here. Get us into your head at that time and talk to us about how that affected the plans that you hoped to implement as Premier, but presumably now realized were not going to happen.
No, it's not that simple. My philosophy was then, and by the way, is now, that government has a special responsibility in a time of economic difficulty. And I felt that we had some room, some financial, fiscal room, if you like, to do some things which needed to be done. I think the other two factors which we had to take into account was the changing role and the position of the federal government and their financial difficulties and the challenge facing the whole country. This wasn't, while the crisis, it's fair to say, centered more in Ontario than anywhere else, just because of the circumstances of what had taken place. It's also true that other parts of the country were affected. So no, my view was that there were some things we needed to do that I'm glad we did, and that we continued to move ahead with through the 5 years. Again, much against some of the conventional wisdom of some, the business community, but I find it interesting now that people talk about infrastructure and people talk about subways. The same people want to build subways today who canceled them all in 1995 and spent $100 million filling up holes so we wouldn't have a subway to the airport and we wouldn't have a subway to York University. And now those things are coming back and people are saying, gosh, we should have done that a long time ago.
I am going to get to that, actually.
We did it a long time ago.
I am going to get to the issue of political timing, because it is true. Much of what you proposed back then and were castigated for is now conventional wisdom today. But I guess where I was going was that to the extent that people remember that first anniversary of your time, we're now talking October 1991, If my recollection's correct, your highest profile promise from that campaign was to bring in public auto insurance, and on the first anniversary you said we can't do it because it'll lay off thousands of people in the middle of a recession. I mean, that's got to be a pretty good example of a plan you wanted to do but couldn't do because of the economy.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I would argue with you. I don't think it was. In fact, in the election, the actual election of 1990, I don't actually think it was the highest profile promise. I think it had been a high profile issue in 87, I think is when it had been a big profile issue. But I think it would have receded by then, but there was still a lot of people in the party who felt this was kind of something that absolutely needed to be done and was a key priority. It became clear to me as the year proceeded that actually it wasn't a key priority, whether I was right or I was wrong. Managed to persuade the cabinet and then managed to persuade the caucus that that was something that we should not do at that particular time, because we had so many other big priorities ahead of us that we had to move ahead on. I mean, there are people who disagree with that decision. That's fine. I accept that. But yeah, certainly it was at the time when we made that decision in 1991. It was a high-profile decision to say that may have made sense at a certain other time. Right now, it's not a priority for us, and we're not going to proceed with it.
How hard was it to keep the party and the caucus together, given the retreat on that policy?
Actually, it was not as hard as you might have thought. The cabinet came around. There were some dissidents in the cabinet who weren't happy, but they all went along with it. Nobody resigned over it. And I made a point of really trying to persuade, saying, let's talk this issue through. So it went to the priorities and committee of cabinet. It then went on to cabinet. It then went into the caucus. We got a caucus meeting in Huntsville. There were some people who felt very strongly the other way, most notably Mr. Cormos and a couple of other people. But frankly, not a deep-seated thing, and not a deep-seated thing in the labor movement. Or elsewhere, it was not a thing in the public that caused a huge reaction. There were people who were disappointed, and obviously there were people in the party who were, for whom this had been a kind of an important symbol. But I must confess that certainly I don't think it was as monumental a decision as perhaps some people have made it out to be.
Needless to say, the unions were beyond thrilled when you won that election and were sworn in 20 years ago today. What was it like trying to deal with their expectations?
Well, this is not a new problem for social democratic governments. That if you look at the UK and other places, it's a long-standing issue. I developed over the years a very strong relationship with a number of not only leaders but members of the labor movement. I'm proud to say that a lot of that remains in place today, even though we're talking about very changed circumstances in every way, shape, and form. I think there were areas where we were in strong agreement. For example, on the jobs front, I think everybody appreciated the fact that we were trying very hard to save jobs. We were trying very hard to create jobs in an environment where that was very difficult, because the first year of government, the province was shedding jobs like crazy. Our unemployment rate almost doubled, and the speed with which we went from a relatively high inflation, high growth economy to a zero inflation and zero growth economy was really quite dramatic. It was kind of like a screeching halt, and the forces behind that, of course, you can look at it now and say, well, it started in 89 and then came through in 90 and went right through to 91, and then slowly the recovery started. The private sector union people, I think, understood very well what the challenge was, and we dealt a lot with them on Algoma Steel and Spruce Falls Paper and all the paper mills across northern Ontario. We did 107 restructurings as a province in those early years. Virtually all of them were successful. All of them involved not just the public backstopping, but the Premier getting involved and the ministers getting involved in making things happen. And I think the unions in the end appreciated that. They did not appreciate being told they had to take less. There were concessions involved in a lot of the restructurings, which the unions did not relish, but I think they enjoyed having a government that was clearly doing its best to help out communities. Obviously, there are people who want you to do everything and want you to do more, but I think that on the whole, that private sector support from the trade union movement was pretty strong,
Well,
and
except
remained
that,
strong, frankly, until the end.
but except if I remember one of your books, the story you told, it was a private sector union head, Bob White from the Canadian Auto Workers, who basically came to your office one day and said, just default on the deficit, don't worry about paying the money back. That sounded like odd advice.
That was, Bob was, I think, was expressing some real frustration on the behalf of union members, saying we're being asked to give, and you know, why don't other people give? Why don't the bondholders give? And that was not actually in my office. That was at a meeting that Roy Romano and Mike Harcourt and I held with the CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, to talk about the situation facing the provinces, the party across the country. And that was a very tough meeting. That's true. But when I come back to look at the Ontario situation, and you know, with a few exceptions, I think if people were honest with themselves, even today, they'd say, yeah, we saw what he was trying to do, and we didn't think it was a terrible thing.
I'm not trying to put you on a couch here or anything, but I'll confess to being one of a number of
Go ahead.
one of a number of reporters who have tried to sort of pinpoint the moment over the years where you became less enamored with the New Democratic Party philosophy, and obviously you've eventually ended up in the Liberal Party. And I think most people think that happened after you stopped being Premier. But I wonder whether you can pinpoint some of it to the time when you were Premier, when there seemed to be a lack of reality among some of your troops to the realities that you were having to deal with. Is that possible?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of not being, so if you say enamored with the New Democratic Party. I think the best way of describing it and trying to, you know, get your listeners to sort of recall and remember. I mean, I felt my whole time in politics, I mean, first career in politics, if you like, as a leader of the New Democratic Party in Ontario, and as the finance critic for the party in the years before that, was that we had to come in out of the cold. We could not remain a marginal party and do what we had to do on behalf of the working families of Ontario and Canada. That we had to take responsibility for decisions, that we had to work with the centre, and that we had to govern. If we ever governed, we had to govern from the centre. And I can remember saying that many, many times from platforms and from pulpits as the Premier of the province, saying that I'm the Premier of all the people, and I'm going to try to govern from the centre because that's the best place to govern. And I think there were a whole lot of people in the New Democratic Party who were never comfortable with that idea. I think they felt that that wasn't where they wanted their leadership to be, and that wasn't exactly how they wanted to express things. And I respect that.
But did you also think at that time, maybe I'm not the right fit for this party after all?
Well, I think that final thought didn't really come to me until after the government's defeat and after my replacement by Howard Hampton, and it then became clear to me that the majority of the party, the working majority of the party that had made that choice, that made those choices, really was of the view that, you know, this was all a very unfortunate experience, that gosh, we wish it hadn't happened and hadn't happened that way, and there was not a word of defense of anything that we tried to do as a government, even from ministers who'd been at the table and had supported what we had done. A lot of people just walked away from you know, both difficult decisions and also what I felt were major accomplishments. And frankly, I felt that the party, in a sense, had left me, had left the government, or what we were trying to do, what we'd tried to do. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe I overreacted, but I had that sense. And I think it was my decision to run as a Liberal later on was not a kind of a walk in the snow moment of moment of clarity or whatever, or of confusion if you take the other position. It was much more a sense that, look, I've evolved, I've moved, you haven't moved, or you've moved in a different direction. What can I say? I mean, I don't think for most people in their own lives, I'm sure they've gone through those experiences with friends, with partners, with other people. You say, I'm now here, we were there, we had wonderful times together there, but now things are very different. And I don't have any regrets about having led the party and having led the government. I'm very proud of what we tried to do, and consistently talked about that in my books and in the work that I've done.
Well, let me follow up on that if I can.
I think it's important to move on.
That's a good, let's talk some legacy issue here, because I remember you famously saying at the time you had a choice to fight the deficit or fight the recession, and, you know, damn it all, you opted to fight the recession. And the approach that you took 20 years ago got you nothing but brickbats and bad headlines, and eventually, you know, lost the government after one term. Today, it very much is conventional wisdom in the Western world. Governments are priming the pump, they're doing infrastructure programs, they've ramped up spending to try to protect jobs and so on. You've got to, okay, I shouldn't say that. I'm going to ask it instead of tell you. But can I not assume there's a tiny little bit of bitterness inside you that for basically what you tried to do and got clobbered for 20 years ago, people are now being, you know, plotted for, you know, their intelligent fiscal stewardship today?
No, not at all. I mean, I absolutely. I mean, I can. I'm not a bitter guy at all, Steve. I don't go through life that way at all.
Not a tiny piece of you?
I think not in the slightest. Not in the slightest. I think the debate, if you like, is an ongoing debate over the last 25 or 30 years about what is the responsibility of government, how is government, what is the most really fiscally responsible thing to do, and how are we going to balance the need to work with people on jobs and the need to run a prudent, financially intelligent government. And I think that debate goes on. I think the debate's going on today. I think even today, you know, there are debates going on about in the United States and in the UK and everywhere else about how much do we cut back. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the key to getting out of the recession was the recovery in the United States. In Ontario's case, we did a lot to kind of build up the infrastructure, and we had built a very powerful platform to take the province into growth in the late 90s and the early part of the 21st century. I mean, I think some of the stuff that Mr. Harris did, frankly, took away from the strength of the province. I think cutting back on infrastructure as much as he did. I know he'll have a lot of things to say about what the way I did business and the approach that I took. But what I will not wear with any equanimity, I can assure you, is the notion somehow that the government that I led was fiscally irresponsible and didn't have a clue about managing and didn't make any difficult decisions. I mean, we made some very tough decisions, and we knew we had to make them in very tough times. And the growth, frankly, in the Ontario economy, which started in 93 and 94 and 95 and then really moved ahead in 96 and 97, you know, economic growth doesn't have everything to do with which government is in power. I mean, there's some governments that are lucky in terms of the timing in which they're there, and other governments that are unlucky. I think President Obama, for example, is very unlucky in terms of the kind of situation that he's facing, having inherited a very difficult debt and impossible situation. I mean, if anybody I feel totally empathy for right now, it's President Obama. He's facing a very, very similar situation in terms of timing and choices that we had to face in 1990, and it's not easy.
Well, let me do a little what if with you right now. You obviously learned a lot. I remember when you campaigned for the federal leadership of the Liberal Party, you said, I learned a lot in those 5 years.
Yep, absolutely.
So if you'd managed to, let's say some kind of, you know, different circumstances transpired, and you did manage to get a second term, what did you learn during that first term as Premier of Ontario that would have made you a much better government had you got a second term?
Well, just read the speech that I gave at the Empire Club. I think our mutual friend, Jim Quell, reproduced it in the Toronto Star a couple of months ago. I think that we were, fiscally, we were in a much better position to make decisions. We were ready to move ahead on the education reforms, which Madame Bégin and Jerry Kaplan had set out in their very, very significant commission report, which was going ahead. Now, finally, after Charles Pascal's great work, is producing full-day kindergarten. We were ready to move ahead with that in 1995, and we would have had the means to do it. Carrying on with the infrastructure stuff and then helping industry to make some of the adjustments and changes which needed to be made, and leading Ontario's approach outside with respect to exports and the kind of broad-based international approach which I tried to set out as Premier in terms of the number of trips which I took to the Far East and elsewhere. And I think, again, that's the kind of approach which other governments today are taking. I mean, what Premier McGuinty's been doing, and in terms of his work in education, I think the ideas that we discussed as a government, as a province at that time, were very, very relevant in the days and months that have come afterwards.
Okay,
And that's why I feel quite comfortable participating in these debates.
In which case, let me take you out of the realm of fantasy, what might have been, and take you into reality. You did mention earlier in our interview here that Mike Harris did fill in the subway holes that you had tried to build. He did cancel photo radar. He did cancel the anti-strike breaker law that you brought in. He lowered the welfare rates, which you had generously put up to protect people during tough times. 20 years later, what still exists so that we would know that the NDP were in power for 5 years in this province in the early 1990s?
Well, it's interesting. When you say that, what still exists? Well, there's a housing stock which is better than it otherwise would have been if it hadn't been for our government. And in fact, if it hadn't been for the 10 years of the Accord government plus our government, we wouldn't have had anywhere near the social housing stock that we have in the city today. And with the fire just this last week in Toronto, I felt very much that exemplified, if nothing else, just how fragile the whole social network system is in our country and in our province and in our city. Something I think we all need to reflect on as we go forward. I was in Elliott Lake over the summer, and we had to make a very difficult decision about Elliott Lake, about transforming the way hydro worked and so on, and changing a mine contract, laying off a lot of miners, and nothing easy, nothing popular. I was greeted by people as saying, "You're the guy who saved Elliott Lake," because of course Elliott Lake is now a large retirement community, because we insisted that that take place over time. What I find interesting is I go across the province, Steve, and I know people think I'm making this stuff up, but it actually happens. I have people come up to me saying, women coming up to me saying, if it hadn't been for Jobs Ontario, if it hadn't been for Jobs Ontario training, I wouldn't have been able to get off welfare. I wouldn't have been able to make the transition that I made. I have people talking to me about the Environmental Bill of Rights, how this is seen as signature legislation not only for Ontario, but now been matched by the federal government. We now have, I think, a much greater environmental consciousness than we've had. That was very much a hallmark of our government, very much at the center of what we were trying to do. Again, not always popular when we did it. The Tories never changed the forestry legislation we brought in because it was so sensible and so sound.
Shouldn't forget casinos either. We got casinos because of you.
Well, we also avoided losing tens of thousands of jobs to the United States, because that's the direction in which we were moving. But we got casinos in a very limited way, in a very controlled way, in a way that I think most people now feel made some sense in a difficult circumstances. We don't have those, slot machines in every drugstore, which is the direction that it took in a number of other jurisdictions, not only in Canada but also across the United States. So we made those decisions, and you look back at them and you say, well, could you have done some things differently? The answer is, of course you could. I mean, any sensible person would feel that way. But I don't look back with any great sense of regret. I look back with a great sense of pride. And I find that as I travel across the province and talk about this, the last funny thing that happens to me now is I have a lot of 20-year-olds coming up to me saying, "Ray Days, are you the guy from Ray Days? Like, are you the Bob Ray from Ray Days?" I say, "Yeah, absolutely." They say, "Fantastic." They said, "That was the best thing that ever happened." And I have lots of teachers now saying to me, "We finally figured out what you were trying to do." So all these things come home. People will have different views, but I'm still very feisty and very proud of what I was able to do as Premier, and very proud of what I'm still doing in public life, which I thoroughly enjoy.
Mr. Ray, it's good of you to spend a bit of time with us on this 20th anniversary of your swearing in as the 21st Premier of Ontario. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Great to be with you.